The grate indoors. Barry sat nervously as he watched the other candidates enter. When he applied for this post, he was pretty sure the job was his. Who had his contacts? Who had his experience in Stoke in 1978? This wasn't London. Yet, the informal meet and greet he expected was clearly something quite bigger when he was told to take a seat and complete a form. He was 27, a fine age for an architect and a left-sided midfielder, not that Stoke had many of either, and yet here he was surrounded by specimens whose acne still showed signs of persisting, the ink still wet on their certificates, the part on their CV where it says professional experience blank or embellished with delusions of grandeur at having once put up a tent successfully. Why did the owner not just tell all these kids to go home via Wimpy and state the position had been filled? Why was Barry made to wait? He felt his delightfully prepared dialogue turn to mush the longer he was sat outside. They called him, and in he went. The owner was delighted to see him. They had both studied at Birmingham together. Together in the sense of apart. Barry was a fresher and Simon completing his MA project, but the rub of fellow alumni would surely count for something in Barry's eyes. They had been at events together too, Barry embarrassingly trying to sidle up to Simon and get an introduction, failing miserably and pretending he never wanted to meet him in the first place, taking solace in the free and largely unpalatable wine that he managed to sink. When the opportunity came for them to share some words, Barry's were inarticulate and bordering on profanity. Simon smiled a condescending look and carried on with his importance. Barry told himself there was no way that Simon would remember that. After all, it was 3 years and Simon must meet drunk idiots every day. Composing himself, he entered. "Barry," Simon said with worrying glee. "I trust you have only been at the mineral water today?" He joked. Spiffing. Barry thought to himself, suddenly bereft of any decent expletives. He took a seat and enjoyed that awkward moment as Simon perused his CV like he had never seen the thing before. How could he have called him to an interview if he hadn't even seen the CV? Barry pondered as he felt his wrists sweat. He had been expecting the palms and the pits, that was a given, but the wrists were a new one on him. He wanted this job, he wanted to stay in the Potteries. He was in no mood to uproot to London and slowly die a dystopian death every day of his life. There were some lovely places in the vicinity, of course, the town was dreadful, but maybe this job would be a means of changing that. "I'm so glad you could come in to see us, Barry," Simon said. Barry knew what was coming. He was on the shelf at 27, usurped by a spotty upstart virgin. On the shelf before he had even been taken out of his packaging. Why was life so unfair? Why did he have to be born in this backwater that failed to recognize his flair, his talent, his artistry? Oh, how he wished he had been born within the sound of the bow bells and could swap the hammers for Vale. Then they would see his worth, but nobody ever would, as he was effectively dead. Instinctively, his hand went into his jacket pocket, cutting a wholly unprofessional pose with the assistance of the sweaty wrist. Therein, he felt the jeweller's box containing the engagement ring, a square inch of hopes and dreams that would now be better placed at the tip or smelted down to make a badge that just said loser. To end up like this was a particular disgrace. Now he had to return to his family members who told him he was wasting his time by studying architecture, by studying anything. Suddenly repairing washing machines was above him. They took his stance on education as a personal affront on those hard-working upstanding members of society who put the hours in, did the shifts and accepted their lot. Not the flowery post-hippie generation who shunned the idea of hard work. Barry wanted to work. He wanted to put the hours in, but someone had to recruit him first. That stung. He never got the chance to shine, he never even got the chance to screw the bulb in. And this evening, he will be in the local, withstanding a barrage of "I told you" SOS as he watched his darling finally abscond into the arms of the local cricket team captain, the barrister. As Barry sipped on his disappointingly warming pint of mild, he felt his grip on her loosening. His insipid tales of the catch he took at silly mid-off slowly winning her over as she opted for security over happiness. She would remain in touch with his parents and send them postcards from their villa in Menorca, his mother admonishing him for allowing her to slip through his fingers. He noticed that there was a barman's position vacant. Would that not be beneath him? He would now have to serve the people in whose attendance he frequented the bar beforehand, Now he would be their underling, pouring their pints at the hope of hearing the magic words, "Take one for yourself." He decided he was still far away from bar work. Why not go to Manchester? Or Liverpool? Or even London? Because this was the 70s and the streets were paved with white dog poo and nothing more. What had punk rock taught him? He listened to the Clash, but wanted to be an architect. He was not invited to the punk party. He wore beige corduroy for pleasure. Did he really think Joe, Paul and John were directing their vitriol towards a provincial architecture graduate? Not good enough for punk, not good enough for her. He took another sip of the drink, but it almost refused to go down his throat. His stomach felt tiny as he watched a world go by in which he was now not even a participant. He wondered what the dreams of the people on the other tables were, peeping into their stolen moments, a lifetime of happiness before them, or a lifetime of felicity to reflect on. And him, with warm mild. He refused a top-up and decided to walk home. It was a pleasant evening and the spring air would clear his head, he thought. At a delightfully equidistant point between the pub and his parents, where he would be ensconced forever, the heavens decided to play a trick on him, opening up and pouring their discharge angrily. He had left his jacket behind. Such was his rush to escape the hell of modern life. Wind and rain buffeted him mercilessly as he disproved the theory that you get less wet if you run, walk or stop. Beginning to shiver with the cold that pervaded his body, he took shelter under a tree. From there he could see the new builds that everyone in the town dreamed of, a garage and front and back gardens, 3 bedrooms, fitted kitchen, downstairs lavatory, the stuff of dreams, but not the dreams of potential barmen. The shelter from the tree was disturbed when the weather took a further turn for the worse, and lightning struck it. Barry remembered where he was. "I feel dreadful about keeping you waiting so long. But we wanted to make sure that your assistant would be up to the challenge. We have had some fine candidates and hope that under your auspice to implement a mentor system to foster future generations of architects. Who knows, in a few years, we can really put Stoke on the map. I assume you are in?" Simon asked. Barry needed proof that this was not a continuation of the dream and forced his key through the lining of his trouser pocket, so it broke and pierced the skin. That would do him. With perhaps less eloquence than he had hoped for, he accepted the post. He had long played out the scene in his mind. His victory march. His chance to rub everyone's faces in it. All those times he had had to endure their endless sermons on how he was wasting his time, how he was flushing his youth down the drain. Now he could sit back and enjoy the glory. Except he couldn't. He hadn't even started work. He could lose the job in 2 weeks and be back with his tail between his legs. His paranoia would prevent him from gloating. He walked home past the new builds, declining the relative comfort of the number 43 bus. Stoke looked different today. Stoke looked like a place with a dream. His dream. The first year at work was a learning curve. Him and Simon fought for government-sponsored housing and building contracts that would drag the city into the late 20th century before it was indeed too late. The hours were grueling. Half the time he devoted more of his efforts to fighting with accountants and making budgets meet than designing anything. As his assistant, Marjorie, became more adept at her tasks, she relieved the pressure on Barry. Thus, the ideal team was formed. Simon loved gallivanting around in his Simito coupe, impeccably dressed, heading off to Italy to invest in a vintners, taking the credit and generally being the face of the organization. To suggest he did not pull his weight would be cruel though. Simon was no slouch. Barry was the creative brain and Marjorie the engine. As the 70s became the 80s, the face of Stoke grew, as did the company, taking on more staff as it received accolades. It was a joyous time for Barry. He married Susan and moved into something far superior to the new builds he had previously dreamt of. He moved his parents into his former dreams so that they would be more comfortable. As the company became more successful, they took on a share of glamorous cutting-edge projects whilst reserving an amount of their time for social housing and works that would benefit the region as a whole. Awards and plaudits followed, as did tempting offers from the capital, but they resisted the lure and continued to work towards their dream. It was a dream that had never been clearly defined, still the fruit of the dream was theirs to see. They became more selective over the years. Barry remembering the very day when he used the cash machine to check his balance and saw a plus sign followed by £1 million and a bit pounds. He set about designing his dream house. Located on the lands adjacent to the Westlands, Barry made a conscious decision to design his and Simon's with sufficient space between them to ensure neither would ever ask the other for a cup of sugar. They had worked together almost day in day out for 15 years, but if you asked Barry to describe 5 things about Simon not related to their work, he would struggle. Barry did not need to know Simon on the golf course, in the wine bar or at the lodge. The two enjoyed a harmony in their workplace like Lennon and McCartney, but in Stoke, in the sphere of architecture, Barry would revel in the stats, fireproof certificates, clean energy before people even mentioned dirty energy. Houses of the future, now. Barry hated the tagline, but it worked, and he never set foot in the domain of Simon nor vice versa. That was the key to their success. The house took a year to build. Barry stealing moments from work when he could, but most of the endeavours were performed in his free time. Susan enjoyed the decorating aspect and the twins, now in their teens, mucked in as much as they could. The fear was that it would remain a great unfinished project. The time constrictions and the sheer scale of the endeavour would make it unviable as time went by, a Potteries Petrocelli. Business also suffered in the 90s as depression threatened the construction sector, but even when it looked bleak, they came out the other side, councils and governments knowing that what the pair could offer was something extraordinary. The rise of the internet also offered opportunities and challenges to a firm that tried its hardest to stay ahead of the game. The problem now was that the game was changing so fast that by the time they had implemented the latest development, a new one came to take its place. The decision was made to expand the staff and recruit an IT department, spotting ads in Iron Maiden t-shirts with dubious haircare routines who spoke a language unbeknown to laymen. Survival, flourish, downturn, rinse and repeat. These were the cycles of their enterprise and live with them they must. When the house was finished, in 1997, Barry was close to his 20th anniversary at the company. He was now a full partner and had been the recipient of a nod for his services to architecture. Simon got a CBE and that riled him for a bit, but then he let it pass. He did wonder who would be the first of the pair to become Sir. He liked the idea of Sir Barry and set about finding out how many of them there were. A new millennium ushered in with the company wholly aware that the bugs people talked about would not cause society to grind to a halt. Society was unstoppable, getting larger and smaller at the same time. In 2002, they completed the first remotely managed architecture project in the world, an aqueduct in Bolivia. Nothing could stop them. On the banks of the Thames, the limestone Andry plant heaved and spurted its content into the air and river. The report from the Environmental Committee spearheaded by the government sat unopened on the CEO's desk. The news inside would not be good, so one way of avoiding it was to imagine it did not exist. The measures that would be outlined therein would have a negative effect on the CEO's favourite column, profit. The company could manage, it could even take the initiative to oversee a new era of responsible chemical plants, but they would involve a hell of an amount of effort, a strain on the purse strings and a drop in dividends. The latter caused the most concern. Dividends falling meant unhappy investors whose fickle nature may lead them to the other bank of the river. He was sure this was just a fad. His company was not the biggest criminal in the field, so why should they be singled out? A nice donation would probably smooth things over, once they had completed the German order. Once that was shipped, then he could do something, or nothing, or be seen to be doing something. Either way, he was busy. You didn't simply get to the position he was in without taking risks and making enemies. He didn't get into this to win any popularity contest, which was just as good. His BlackBerry buzzed to inform him that he had a message. We have to do something about that report. It was a message from the deputy CEO, a person entrusted with that position to do what he said, not to tell him what must be done. There is too much evidence on site. This is beyond a fine, this is entering the realm of closure, maybe even punitive sentences. The dramatic little prick continued. The CEO poured himself 4 large scotch worth more than the cleaners on the floor's combined salary and plugged in his headphones. He took out his putter and practiced his game on the specially conditioned trough of turf he boasted in his office. He deleted the deputy CEO's email and treated himself to another drink. An hour later, he was asleep on the couch. The deputy CEO sent another mail that went unseen. Surprise inspection. His contact at the ministry had leaked that in 7 days they would be receiving a visit and that the plant had better be suspiciously cleaned by then. When the CEO awoke with a fuzzy head, he hurled the device at the wall and got one of the cleaners to call him a taxi. Over the weekend, production at the plant continued at the accelerated rate to meet the German order. The deputy CEO's warning about the levels was based on Thursday's readings. By Monday morning they were off the scale. No clean-up would cover the evidence before the inspection. An angry exchange took place in which the CEO claimed that the deputy was concealing information from him, and the latter was sacked. The German order was completed and dispatched, and the leftover poison dumped into the Thames. Production was halted from then on, and all hands were put to making the plant shine. When the inspectorate arrived, there was a modicum of chin-rubbing at how a previously denounced plant could be so pristine, and the call was made to the head of the inspectorate. The latter, who had received a sizable incentive from the CEO just the day before, promised to look into the matter personally once the 14 files on top of this dossier had been dealt with. In the meantime, they were told to carry on and inspect what they could see. The members of the inspectorate were told to perform their tasks and appraise what they could see. They took readings and noted that everything was within the confines of the law and went. Pleased with his work for the day, the CEO reinstated the deputy CEO with a pay cut and counted the money from his latest deal. Delighted at his management skills, he spent the rest of the day at the golf course. Martin closed the fridge door. He was sure that there was a bottle of sparkling water inside, but the results were disappointing. His thirst, raging after coming in from a run, without even counting the 4 blocks he had to climb to his apartment as the lift was out of order again, needed abating. Despite his better judgment, he took the glass and let the tap run for a moment, filling the glass and swigging back the liquid offered by the City of London Corporation. He felt like heading back out for something purer, even a tin of lilt, but he had to find a job. He had been loaned a laptop and had embarked upon a romantic liaison with his next-door neighbor as a means of procuring her Wi-Fi password for the duration of his search. He checked his CV. The last update was March 2003, and it was now January 2005. More than 18 months unemployed, yet he was desperate not to leave such a large gap in his professional history. He had always been good with his hands and had been one of the top mechanics at a major chain until the cutbacks saw him removed from the roster. Since then, he had done things for friends, word of mouth, but nothing that the Inland Revenue or a potential employer could steal or appraise as applicable. He wanted to work. He was tired of downgrading from the comfortable flat in Zone 2 to his near-French quarters in Zone 6. He called his mate Carl and asked if he could put on his CV that he had been an assistant mechanic at his garage for the last 6 months at least. Carl was a decent guy who knew how tough things could be. If things were different, he would love to have Martin on the payroll, but they weren't, and they didn't look like they ever would be. Martin thanked Carl and clicked update. He waited for a response, somehow convinced that the lack of time he had to enjoy the laptop would force a future employer to respond quicker. As he waited, he noticed the taste in his mouth becoming more and more bitter. His mouth became dry and his first instinct was to seek out more water poisoned by limestone sandry that was circulating around all the taps in the city and slowly being exported to the surrounding areas. That second glass proved to be a lethal dosage. Martin would never receive the email from Harvard's offering him a position. 47 minutes later, his body went into seizure and he would soon die alone in his flat. He had been exposed to the highest dose possible. Only those who consumed close to a pint of the liquid at that exact time and in his and the surrounding postcodes were susceptible to such a rapid demise. Those who continued to consume the liquid over the 4 days before the contamination was located would wish for their suffering to end in less than an hour. Within a week, half of London was contaminated, to a lesser or greater extent, the poisoned water flowing freely into the poorest homes first, then indiscriminately into more expensive properties. 7 people died on the same day as Martin in his block, the authorities convinced that the source of contamination had been located inside the actual installations of the block. When people started dying in adjacent areas that did not share installations, more answers were needed. The authorities' first instinct was to tell people not to use tap water. That is easier said than done for the majority of people. They also misinformed them that as long as the water was boiled beforehand, it would be safe to use. It was later proven that boiling actually increased the contamination capacities, meaning that in 48 hours, more than 200 people had died in agony in the capital. Once the source was finally located, half of the South's water supply was infected. By then, it was too late for many, as the warnings had fallen on deaf ears or people simply could not use mineral water for everything. Even those who had avoided direct consumption needed to wash. After 72 hours continuous contact with the venomous water, people's skin began to flake and fall off, leaving unsightly sores that were prone to infection. Brushing teeth with the water caused the gums to inflame, with the swelling passing through the mouth and affecting the tongue so that the airways were blocked. By this time the CEO had disappeared on his private jet. Government was rocked. Something so basic as water had been violated. The simplest source of life, yet irreplaceable. The only good news was that it had been stopped before it reached Birmingham to the north, and Bristol to the west. Decontamination of the infected region was difficult to model. Even after 10 days, the levels in South London were still lethal, the theory of constant dilution not proving particularly accurate. Indeed, in certain areas, the underlying poor quality of the water led to a breeding ground of the substance that caused the contamination. This meant that areas that were almost clean could be reinfected. The City of London made the onerous decision to cut off the water supply in the city, with other areas following suit soon. People now had no access to water, but provisions from the rest of the country were transported south to cover basic needs. Each citizen was allotted 4 litres of government-approved water per day, supplied in 28-litre bidons on a weekly basis. That water was for everything, from cooking to washing to drinking. The shelves were empty of bottled water, with a litre of Evian costing more than a bottle of Mitten Shandon. Life in the contaminated zone became a struggle, which soon became a lawless struggle. Government, and the other bodies of national importance, decided to temporarily relocate to a safer home. In February 2005, the government passed its Emergency Requisition Response Act. This act endowed it with powers to do as its name suggested. Certain bodies of government would relocate to the safer areas of the north, Scotland, Wales and the southwest until the South's water supply could be guaranteed once more. The affluent zone of the Westlands in Stoke was chosen for its desirable properties to serve as government offices and residences for top-end civil servants. Barry was informed on Monday morning that his property was being requisitioned and that his family would have to make alternative arrangements for the duration of the disaster. The general feeling was that once those in power were safely ensconced in their new and poison-free abodes, their interest in resolving the situation swiftly would not be a priority. They would not wish to return to London until they knew it was safe. Basically, they formed a puppet government that did even less than it had in its capital home. It did, though, make one important decision that was to change the course of the disaster and the nation's future. Rather than finding a solution under its own volition, the government outsourced its issue to Europe, based on the decision that they could solve it while the former could take the credit. In exchange for this, Europe demanded the British government and the Queen sign a document stating that no attempts would be made to disrupt, leave or alter the European Union by the Brits for the next 50 years. With all sides happy, the parties began putting the boffins to work to cleanse the capital's water. In the meantime, Barry's alternative accommodation had also been requisitioned, which meant he was forced to reside in temporary lodgings provided for displaced persons. This meant they were assigned a dwelling in Mare, in a housing complex that was on the company's list for refurbishment, in this part of the region, that was a long list and depended on funding that would never arrive. They were offered superior accommodation in London, but that involved taking your chances with the slowly improving, if you believed the government, water supply. If Barry and his family had no desire to move to London when things were going spiffingly, they were loath to do so now. They assured the children that it would only be temporary, and may even be character building, packing their allotted suitcase per person and moving in. The company's offices were also taken for the Ministry of Transport, meaning this meant that the company, still obliged to fulfill its contractually binding tasks, was forced to operate from porter cabins installed in the grounds. The fledgling wireless internet system that was the pride of the town was unable to withstand the new demands on its bandwidth. With an important bit in the outbox for more than 40 minutes, the company was later informed by fax, what next, carrier pigeons, that it had not submitted the paperwork on time and had been duly excluded. The region's unemployed were set to work transporting fresh water and supplies to the capital. The more financially comfortable members of the community were provided with instant showers that could be inflated inside their properties. The water tank was then filled with clean water imported from the north, and their cleanliness could be maintained. This eased pressure on the government, as it meant that less people would be tempted north. Only official business was allowed to sanction the displacement of owners in the north. But at the height of the crisis, chitties were changing hands at exorbitant prices for people wishing to flee Chelsea and Knightsbridge for a semi-detached on the outskirts of Sheffield. Into the second week of the crisis, the company was obliged to devote 20% of its time to solving issues in the capital and surrounding areas. Barry and Simon egged, unsuccessfully, that their work was designing properties. The properties in the affected areas were, well, unaffected, and that the company's input in the repair of a damaged water network would be minimal. This had the negative effect of shifting the company's purpose from being a provider to purporter, to use the new parlance. If they could not provide 20% of their resources, they would have to surrender 30% of their income, backdated. As each day passed, more and more draconian measures were passed to allow the government to act in the way they wanted. In their new accommodation, Barry's family found themselves with an array of issues that had never been encountered before: damp, inadequate heating, very low water pressure due to the strain placed on the network, food shortages, the good stuff was sent down south, and a run on liquid money. The black market flourished on the estate, had it ever not? As people were prepared to part with sizable sums for basic household goods. Barry lay next to Susan in the 1.35 meters bed. That was a noticeable downgrade from their king size, and made a promise. However bad it got, it would not break them. They promised to learn from this, to come out of this better people. Barry slept very little. He surveyed the meager possessions that symbolized their existence. With that he embarked upon a moment of realization, a kind of epiphany, that was all they were, possessions, essentially meaningless trinkets that had been accumulated without need or thought over a number of years, and that was merely what had been null salvaged. Who knows what pointless trinkets and testimonies to consumerism lurked in the garage? Did any of these things make him happy? What was happiness? His drive for professional success. Did he have happiness on a personal level? Had he sacrificed his family's happiness for his personal progress? Did he know his children? Did anybody? What was the point of so many questions? He thought about the response to the first one and was overcome by sleep. Despite sleep, the questions remained in his head, and he made an oath to himself to find the responses. The moment he began to look for them was when he realized that he already had them. He always had, and that was his liberation. He dreamt of recovering his house for a while, but then realized it was just a building. The place itself did not matter. Obviously, life was easier when all the comforts of modern life were in place to make modern life more comfortable, but Barry was determined to be thankful for what he had, rather than lamenting what he had lost. For a start, he was certain that this situation would not last forever, and that he would soon be reunited with his dream home, but also that once he was back there, once his normality was restored, it would be a different concept of enjoyment. He made a pact with himself not to become enraged by the situation, nor lose the plot when it inevitably got worse, or at least he chose not to openly display any negative emotion. He was unsure whether it was merely a case of his stiff upper lip upbringing that inspired him to take it on the cheek and move forward, or the realization that this was indeed a test, and his behavior during this period would be the future benchmark against which he would be judged. Before this, the family's concerns centered around typical middle-class worries, such as where the cruise would stop. Would they be able to get a table in the new Michelin-starred restaurant they had been told about on the banks of the Seine? Would they be able to erect a marquee in the garden for one of the children's wedding receptions? Barry made a list of all the frivolous things that comprised his leisure time and decided that things would be very different on the other side. How different was the first issue on his mind? He saw a bifurcation in the road, one way offering the chance to avenge the situation and act as the harbinger of justice, the other simply suggested a simpler existence, devoting time to helping people he believed he had beforehand, but now was aware that you could always do more. The question eternally on Barry's lips was how. He looked around the flat they were forced to live in. Yes, the place was dingy, but with regard to size, things were not that bad. A lot of places around the same neighborhood were a lot pokier. The structure, as he saw the thing, had potential. He did have that habit of seeing potential in the least likely places. One day, after his work, he took to wandering about the place, measuring tape and notebook close to hand, and allowed himself the luxury of a dream or two. 2 dreams soon became 3. That after a while was the proem to an idea. He had learnt that word in a short story collection he had picked up for next to nothing at a train station and planned to use it one day. This seemed as good a day as any. And there it was. His life's work was now actually not the creation where he and his family lived, or even the creations before that which had put Stoke on the map. He would now use his time, money and influence to create the finest apartment block he could for the benefit of the residents of the same. He was told in no uncertain terms that if he wished to embark upon this project, it would have to be a solo flight. Simon was not prepared to entertain this idea at his, or indeed the company's expense. Barry was a wealthy man in relative terms. His assets had taken a beating due to this recent crisis, but he had a few pounds to spare. It was only when he began to examine the magnitude of the task did he realize he was relatively poor, certainly not wealthy enough to enter into a venture of this nature. The block had 84 apartments, each one measuring around 84 square meters, which he thought was a nice touch. He realized that his personal fortune would cover the rewiring and maybe the plumbing. The transition to luxury would still be a fair way away. Without financial backing, and the possibility of investors being minimal, of course, if he planned this development with a view to selling it off at an exorbitant price, they would have bitten his hand off, the Barry seal of approval adding value to any work. But this was not the case. It was a social project. People with money did not see how people who could only afford low-level housing should be given anything better for free. He pondered the means of getting the money. He pondered fundraisers, begging the government, but knew what the response would be. The argument against his project is that these people have a place to live. Why do they deserve any special treatment? Deep down, he almost knew they were right. It was unfair, but life is a lottery, and recently not many winning tickets have been drawn round here. As he poured himself a glass of water, Stoke's being deemed the finest in the land, though competition was not fierce, he realized how he could get help. The government had managed to hush up the source of the poisoned water affair and forced the blame on a company that became strangely defunct not long after, meaning it could not shoulder any liability. Barry had been privy to certain documentation that revealed a very different truth, as murky as the poisoned waters of the Thames. The CEO who made the decision escaped punitive reparations, but his joy did not last long as he was consumed by guilt at the extent of his evil endeavors. This led him to God and a life away from his former guise. That said, his wealth remained largely intact. He was supposed to fund certain projects, but the paperwork had been held up. The paperwork for the government sweeteners took no time in getting through. So Malcolm, the CEO, now lived on a Caribbean island in a church that he had acquired to save souls, or something. Barry banked on the extent of his guilt providing the financing. He tracked him down and took a plane, rehearsing his spiel en route. He had such a convincing routine that he was sure this Malcolm chap would have no issues in handing over a very large cheque. Barry pondered whether the size of the cheque was particularly important. If it were a standard size but for £1 billion, and the funds were there, would the bank take umbrage at the size of the counterfoil? Barry realized the time for such thoughts would be later as he introduced himself. You have come a long way to tell that story. I really should tell you where to go. But I am not myself, and maybe that's a good thing. Of course, people think the old Finding God routine is just that. A routine. Maybe I don't even know what is true or false anymore. The only thing I know is that I am still here, in this place, of all places, when I deserve the same fate that befell so many innocent people. You know, I did try not to care when I arrived, to act like it didn't matter, but I was haunted, rightly so. I do not ask for pity as I don't deserve it. However, the chance to do some good may provide some relief. Malcolm said in response to Barry's pitch. So that is a yes? Barry asked, needy of confirmation. Yes, but I can't limitlessly fund the construction of an urban palace for the poor. My repentance is still only on the lower levels. How about you have some money, but the actual residents of the building have to find the means to complete the project? I mean their physical and practical resources, not money. That way we all, will feel like we are doing something together. Malcolm continued. Kevin Costner fan? Barry asked, smiling. He had half expected to return with nothing, so this was a clearly better scenario to be in. A contract was signed for the amount deemed the minimum in Barry's eyes, which was twice the maximum Malcolm wanted, for the completion of the works. Barry was now project manager and set about putting a team together to make it work within the budget. The project was roundly criticized from beginning to end, but Barry never swayed in his dream. He felt that something within was driving him on to complete the work, and enjoyed greatly the spirit shown by the residents who toiled together to pool their talents in the best way possible. Many local tradesmen were proud to be associated with the project and found that being associated with the same often brought in more business than for those who chose to remain outside. It remained a controversial talking point for the 3 years it took to move some way towards completion, yet far from creating an element of envy, it sparked a spurt of camaraderie in other blocks as they sought out the means to upgrade their own living spaces. Malcolm, the disgraced CEO, now revelled in a second coming as a real estate messiah who preached to other equally dishonest characters he had worked with to convert them into sponsoring a block, or two, depending on how much they had swindled. This meant that a series of projects sprung up around the country. It was completely arbitrary, and some projects had more funds allotted than others, but it helped wipe the memory of the water issue. The main problem was that the persons performing or receiving the work had to live in the properties whilst renovations took place, but most of them decided that this was a minor inconvenience given the overhaul they were getting for free. The highlight for Barry was watching people work together, pooling their talents. Even people who did not know that they possessed the talent found a way to offer services to the community. People mocked, mockery often being an expression of jealousy, but precious few found grounds to voice a proper objection. And the government, technically the perpetrators of all of this mess, were pleased that other people's money was being spent on these projects. Barry could not remember the last time he actually sat down or took a moment to himself. Simon was still demanding his presence at the company, even though it was clear where the former's interests now lay. The latter began quietly making arrangements for a replacement, suggesting Barry go part-time, reducing the workload and generally letting him know that he was being moved upstairs. Exhausted, he sat down on a sofa made by 2 Lithuanian factory workers who had not touched a chisel in years, indeed never in their new residence. It felt comfortable at first, though after a few moments, his stomach began to rumble. He touched it and noticed that he was hemorrhaging. The ambulance arrived in minutes. After a brief stay in hospital, Barry was told his chances were not good. The recommendation was a hospice. He did not want that, so made a pact with Susan to be laid to rest inside his dream project. With the help of the workers on his floor, when the time came, a specially devised deep wall was created with an upright coffin inside. This was surrounded by concrete that would solidify and hold his tomb in place. Barry got to see the bedroom of his flat, everyone working at double speed to complete his place before time ran out, and there, in the comfort of his ultra-modern sleeping quarters, he peacefully made the final journey. He was treated rightly as a hero as an empty coffin was taken to the local cemetery for a fake burial. A select few witnessed him placed standing up into his coffin and enclosed into the wall of his living room, the wall painted over in white and with a single red rose in the middle, where, approximately, Barry's heart would be. The technology in place in the building meant that over time Susan could turn to her late husband's pearls of wisdom in darker moments, becoming something of a forerunner to what younger readers may now know as Alexa, thus maintaining Barry's legacy. Simon later moved into politics to make sure that 2 values were upheld. The community projects were always to remain in the hands of those who had made a reality of a dream, and secondly, the European Union's insistence of no British meddling was taken seriously, and any plans to suggest a referendum or a departure being shelved for eternity. When Britain adopted the euro in 2015, Barry's face adorned the reverse of the €2 coin, as Susan looked at the wall where he laid and wondered whether she could join him when her health became more fragile. She looked out over Stoke and felt a tear form as she said his name.